that, and without any further ado, we have here to tell all of us his electrifying story, Peter Litter.
I'm not sure how electrifying the story will be, but it certainly is enlightening for me and humbling. I owe my life to the National Lawyers Guild. I was seized on May 28th when I was having a cup of coffee and a croissant, taken to a detention facility and held without contact with the outside world for nearly a month on charges of genocide denial because of what I had written on the internet and because of evidence that I found in the UN files that explained that what happened in Rwanda, that you know, that everyone else has heard, is completely false. You know that Daniel Ellsberg found the Pentagon papers. You know that WikiLeaks got information from the Pentagon that they put into the world. What you don't know yet is that the United Nations has files on Rwanda that show that the guys who won the war in Rwanda, who are the guys who are in power in Rwanda, who are the guys who arrested me in Rwanda, who are the guys who have been supported by the U.S. Pentagon for 15 years in Rwanda, who are the guys who have been supported by the State Department for 15 years in the UN Tribunal for Rwanda, are the guys who are responsible for the Rwandan genocide. And the reason that I ended up sleeping on a concrete floor, being surrounded by 16-year-old kids with AK-47s, is because I had the evidence that caused my client at the Rwanda Tribunal, who was one of the chief military officers in the former government, to be acquitted of all charges related to conspiracy and planning to commit genocide, because in fact there was no long-term conspiracy to commit genocide or other crimes on the part of the guys who lost the war. An extraordinary claim based on everything you've known and heard. But I want you to begin to think about this with me in a way that will help us all think about the rule of law in the period of the sole superpower, that has implications not only for international law, but for the future of rulings, for example, like U.S. versus U.S. District Court, that we're all familiar with in the coming period. Because my thesis is that in the world of the sole superpower, the rule of law is under threat in ways that we couldn't have imagined before. And I think what's happened at the Rwanda Tribunal is a small example of that. I think what's happening domestically with respect to the creation of executive power domestically and the expansion of presidential power domestically is another example of that. Because my thesis is that the definition of the sole superpower is a power that is not restrained by law. Well, the prevention of the falsification of history is something that occurred quite by accident, because a tribunal was set up after this Rwandan genocide occurred in 1994. Now, Robert McNamara, as you recall, was the subject of a documentary called The Fog of War. If you recall, in the beginning of that documentary, there was the photos of Tokyo burning after the gasoline bombing of Tokyo, which killed more people than Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And McNamara quite honestly said, you know, if the Japanese had won the war, those of us who planned the gasoline bombing of Tokyo would have been war criminals. And so it was, and certainly was true. What you need to remember, and what the world needs to remember, is everything that you know about the Rwanda genocide you learned from the side that won the war and from the superpower that supported them in winning the war. Well, let's see what else we can learn from the fact that there was a tribunal, because the tribunal created some situations that were quite unpredictable. What we now know in 2010, 16 years after the 1994 Rwandan genocide, is that only members of the defeated army and government have been prosecuted at the Rwandan tribunal. That the Rwanda Civil War is the only war in history, which means that this means that the Rwanda War is the only war in history in which only one side committed crimes, or the Rwanda tribunal has been manipulated to prosecute only one side, the same way that the Tokyo and Nuremberg tribunals were established as victor's justice. Now, happily, that contradiction has been resolved for us, because in 2009, the chief prosecutor for the UN Tribunal wrote a memoir in which she explained that in 2003, Carla Del Ponte was called to the State Department by the War Crimes Ambassador for Mr. Bush and ordered not to prosecute the side that won the war at the tribunal, although she had evidence that they committed genocide, war crimes, other crimes of massive nature, because the U.S. had a special relationship with that government. And when she told the War Crimes Ambassador that she worked for the UN, not for the United States, he told her that's what she would think. She was removed from office 6 weeks later. The fact is, the UN Tribunal for Rwanda is an extension of U.S. foreign policy. My thesis is that in the world of the sole superpower, it would be unusual to imagine that any international tribunal would not be an extension of the power of the sole superpower. The question is how the sole superpower would exercise its power in any particular circumstance. The story of the Rwanda genocide is the one you know. Between April and June 1994, only 100 days, for some reason, Rwanda exploded. 800,000 people were killed in 100 days. Most of them were Tutsi. We don't understand who Tutsi are, who Hutu are. It was a terrible thing. But the people who perpetrated this in the next place are Hutus. Well, we don't know who Hutus are either. The whole story is explained ahistorically, non-contextually. Let me try and explain this just briefly, and then I'll explain how we found out what actually did happen in Rwanda by making use of the law, surprisingly enough, in an unintended way. Well, first of all, the Hutu and Tutsi divide is a quite common divide in Africa. It's the same divide that we have in our country between the sodbusters and the cattle ranchers, the herders and the agriculturalists. The Tutsis are the herders, a warrior caste, the Hutus are farmers. Rwanda is a small country on the edge of Congo. It's a French-speaking country in the center of Africa. No slavery had ever taken place there. It was actually a country of its own with an organized structure before the Europeans began invading after World War I. But the caste and ethnicity between the herders and the agriculturalists were formalized by the Europeans, and the Belgians set up this division between Hutu and Tutsi as a way of helping to rule the country. They exaggerated and emphasized the division more than existed under normal circumstances. But Rwanda is not something you can understand without understanding the country next door, which is Burundi. The same ethnic divisions, caste divisions. Burundi and Rwanda were both governed by the Belgians, and they are virtually the same in terms of ethnicity. Politically, they're much different. Sorry, the slide is screwed up here. But in 1992, Rwanda becomes independent. A monarchy is overthrown. The Hutu monarchy, the Tutsi monarchy is overthrown. The Hutu majority, the agriculturalists, take power. They go to Uganda. In Uganda, they become something like the Batista Cubans. Reorganize there, become part of a new society, learn to speak English. In Burundi becomes independent, but the Tutsi aristocracy never gives up power. It becomes a military dictatorship. This goes on until 1990, and in 1990, an army that's part of the Ugandan army invaded